I'm going to turn it over to Josh to introduce folks and to get things going on this panel. But I would want to just, tomorrow night, Dana here is going to be doing another talk on agrarianism, about a forgotten figure in the history of agrarian and environmental thought that Ben has found some really good insights. And in about a week from now, or excuse me, next Tuesday night, Paul Thompson's going to be back out here at the Peace Farm. Paul's one of probably the leading thinkers on agriculture and environmental ethics. He wrote a book, Spirit of the Soil, which was probably the pioneering book in the field. And so he'll be out here talking, and he's always a good person to hear him speak. He's so knowledgeable. I have a few flyers if you want to pick them up, and you forget, I'll set them out here. And Albert Bergman's here, another illustrious speaker that'll be talking next Monday at noon for us. So, Josh?
So first I'll introduce our guests.
Yes.
And then I'll stand up so I can introduce. So starting on my right here is Chrissy McMullen, who works with Grow Montana and was one of the people responsible for passing some really landmark legislation this year that will make agriculture easier to work in our state. And then Ben Mentier, who's an environmental philosopher from Arizona State University, who's visiting Missoula for a few days. Paul Hubbard, my friend Paul Hubbard, who is here representing the Community Food and Agriculture Coalition. And you all know Dan Kemmis, our former mayor, author, scholar at the O'Connor Center for the Rocky Mountain West, and good farmers market customer. So I'm going to start off kind of outlining the problem behind this question, and then we'll hear from these guys their take on this question. So the question is, does agriculture have a future in Missoula County? This arose as a powerful question in my head because I feel like I'm living through two trends happening at the same time that almost seem to work against each other. The first trend is the rise of local agriculture in Missoula. If you go to the farmers market on Saturday, it's booming. It's not a quiet place, it's alive and vibrant. It's a farmers market you'd expect from a city much larger than ours. If you go to the Good Food store, you'll see lots of local products, tons of local products, more than $250,000 spent last year on local food. Our university has a program called Farm to College that Chrissy was one of the pioneers and got it started, spent more than $1 million on food in the state. You add these things up, it looks like local agriculture is just doing terrific, right? And on a growth trend, and we'll see more of it. So let's sort of hold that model over here on one shoulder. Think about the other model here on the other shoulder. Missoula got discovered in the late 80s, early 90s. Though those of you who are my age or older will remember, those younger, you'll just have to take my word for it. This used to be a much quieter place. I'm not going to say it was a better place, it was just a quieter place. I feel like thinking about what's changed in Missoula, it's still the same place, you just turned up the volume. We had great little bits of culture then, and we had sort of the bits of national homogenized culture I sort of feel an allergy to. We had that then too. Now we just have more of everything. It just got bigger. Well, as Missoula got discovered, people moved here in droves. From 1985 to 2000, the number of houses in Missoula doubled. Missoula County doubled. It's pretty amazing in 15 years. The Montana Department of Commerce projects another doubling of houses in Missoula County by 2012, from 2000 to 2012. This is growth at a tremendous rate. The high growth counties in the state of Montana line the western edge and kind of go up into the middle of Yellowstone County. It's shaped like a boot. Our governor calls it the boot. From 1985 to 2000, the boot counties all experienced growth over 50%. And the Montana Department of Commerce projects growth along similar lines till 2030. Well, when these people moved, they needed houses to live in, and houses were built on flat, arable, irrigated land. We've lost farmland at a tremendous rate. So put these two trends together, the popularity of local food and awareness of food, great economic support for local food, and people moving here in droves, smearing the land with sprawl and tract housing and shopping malls, etc. Well, the value of land has gone way up when you add all that in. And the value of food has gone up. So where does this put us? I get to work at this place every day, and when I'm not here, I'm doing similar work at my house. I'm really a fan of this type of stuff. I want it to continue, but I'm personally really nervous for the future because of the skyrocketing land prices and the growth projections. But instead of just listening to my doom and gloom, we'll have some ideas on how to get our way out of this. So first, here's Chrissy, who's going to talk about legislation that she was partially responsible for passing, and some legislative hopes for the future. Chrissy.
Thanks, Josh. So, as Josh mentioned, I work for Grow Montana, which is a statewide coalition working to create a Montana-based food system, because we believe that if we can reconnect farmers and ranchers with local consumers, then we can solve some of these problems that Josh is talking about, and we can overcome some of these problems at least. And so I'm going to talk a little bit at the state level and try and paint the picture that Josh just painted for the state, so that you can kind of have a context for the state level legislation that we just passed as well. And I like to kind of think of it, as Josh described, kind of two sides of the same coin. I like to think of it as kind of three pieces, which I consider the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the good is that there is hope. There is this vibrant local food system movement happening, and it's happening across the state. Montana had 5 farmers markets in 1990, Missoula having one of those, and today we have over 30. So this is growing across the state. They're in Shodo, they're in Glendive, there are farmers markets growing everywhere. Similarly, the Farm to College program that started about 4 years ago, that has returned over $1 million to local farmers and ranchers, is being replicated across the state. So with the help of Grow Montana, we've helped Salish Kootenai College, which is a tribal college up in the Flathead Reservation, start their own Farm to College program. And in the past year, they've gone from 0% of their local food coming from, or of their food coming from local sources, to 10% of their food coming from local sources, which is pretty exciting because they also focus on reservation area vendors. So all of that comes from reservation area food producers. And they also may be the first tribal college to start a farm to college program in the nation that we know of. Also, Missoula County Public Schools has started a farm to school program, and they've purchased a surprising amount of local produce, even though there's only a short window from when school starts to when the Missoula growing season ends. And they actually ended up saving the school district money through that, which is a big relief for the school district, if you know what the school district budget is like at all. Also, Western has purchased so much local beef in the past year that there's a county commissioner there who's ready to start up a beef processing plant in the region. And Montana State University has started a student farm. It's about 6 acres, kind of modeled off this peas farm, and it's up and running. They got 35 subscribers who pay up front to get food throughout the summer. So there's a lot of exciting momentum happening across the state. The bad part is that the challenges that Josh described are not just limited to Missoula. We have other areas of high growth, such as the Gallatin Valley and even the Flathead area. On the kind of flip side of that coin, the urban areas in Montana are suffering from depopulation. And those farmers are struggling to survive too. And we're losing farms and ranches every day. The last count I saw was that we were losing 250 ranches every year. So there are just these bad negative trends that are also happening across the state. And the ugly part, which I know is what you've just been dying to know, what's ugly about it, is that I think the answer lies in public policy. And a lot of people think they don't want to get their hands dirty with public policy, but it really is what I think lies at the heart of the solution, even though there are all these great on-the-ground things that need to happen as well. The reason I think this, and the reason that Grow Montana as a coalition has come together to work on public policy, is that we didn't get in this mess because of consumer demand. So people didn't just start demanding to have more Coca-Cola replace all their local food and their local farmers. what happened was federal subsidies supported the production of corn, which made corn syrup really cheap, which made Coca-Cola interested in selling lots more Coca-Cola, which then resulted in McDonald's policy of asking every single person who comes in if they want to supersize if they want to supersize their Coke, sorry. And so that was not a consumer, rebellion where consumers were wanting more Coca-Cola. It was policies that got us into this mess in the first place, and I think it's policies that are going to get us out. So Grow Montana has come together to work on quite a few state-level pieces of legislation, and the one that Josh was talking about is one of our most exciting, and it just got passed, and it just was enacted July 1st of this year, that allows public institutions to buy Montana-produced food without having to accept the cheapest bid. Because the previous state policy required that all institutions that are public institutions basically just buy the cheapest food that they can. And there's a legitimate reason for that. We want our state to save money, right? But it doesn't work for Montana farmers and ranchers who may not necessarily be able to compete on the global market, even though they can often provide higher quality food that's better for us and that tastes better. So this law is really exciting because institutions spend about $33 million each year on food. So it really is a strong potential market for farmers and ranchers. And even greater than that is that public institutions can serve as kind of a stepping stone for farmers and ranchers who want to get into the local market. So Montanans as a whole spend $3 billion on food every year. So you can see that if they can get into that $33 million market, then this whole much bigger $3 billion market is open and accessible to them as well, which is what Grow Montana is really excited about, to try and really reinvigorate our food and agricultural economy. We also passed several other pieces of legislation, probably one of the most pertinent being a study bill to study Montana's food processing infrastructure and to make recommendations for how we can improve food processing in Montana. Because once you start trying to have this local food system and you start trying to make it more widespread and move beyond farmers markets and into things like institutions, you'll pretty quickly realize that we don't have enough processed food in our state right now. When UM Western went to buy beef, they're literally surrounded by cattle in Dillon. I don't know if you've been to Dillon, but there's cattle everywhere. So it should be pretty easy for them to buy local beef, right? And even some of their food service staff are ranchers. But it took them 2 years to find a burger because all of their ranchers are growing up 2-year-old feeder calves that they're shipping sometimes as far away as Nebraska to be processed and finished. So we don't know where those cows go. So even though we have ranchers literally walking every day to the dining services, we couldn't figure out how to get a burger into the dining services hall for like 2 years. So we figure we need to make some statewide investments to improve that food processing infrastructure. And we know that when Josh was asking to look at policies in the future, that's going to be really a place that we're going to have to focus to keep our food and agriculture system going in Montana, is the infrastructure. And that means the food processing as well as things like distribution. There's a great lentil grower in Conrad who says it's easier for him to get his lentils from to Taiwan than it is for him to get them from Conrad to Helena. So there's a lot of challenges here that we've got to overcome, and I think if we come together and work on public policies as well as these on-the-ground initiatives, that we do have hope for agriculture in Montana and in Missoula.
Do you want to do questions now? We can do questions at the end. Whatever. If anybody has a burning question, you can do it now. Let's go to Paul.
When Josh was talking about this, 2 different food systems happening in Missoula that you can see, it took me back to this kind of schizophrenic emotional response I have to those. You know, if I'm sitting on Reserve Street at a stoplight I'm totally depressed and pessimistic about where the food system's going. You know, looking at some of the most fertile land right here in this county under strip malls. And yet if I'm at the farmer's market around all these farmers and ranchers, or seeing homegrown emerging from the good food store, I get pretty optimistic. But one of the interesting things about our challenges is that we're far from alone. Urban sprawl is an issue in any growing place across the nation. So there's a lot to learn from other communities out there. And I actually brought a cheat sheet with me.
Good for you.
So the kind of three areas I want to touch on from what I take away from other communities is land use planning and dealing specifically with development, where it goes, where it doesn't go, guiding it, bolstering the economic viability of agriculture, and then looking at the long term, how do we keep farms and ranches in business as generations come and go, because that's another side of it. And so for the protecting the agricultural land base, the first lesson I take away from other places is conservation easements are far from enough. It's wonderful to see that we've passed a bond recently to buy development rights off of land, and I think more than anything that's a statement of our values, and farms and ranches were a big part of that value statement, as well as clean water and recreation and wildlife. But it's the conservation easement is a very piecemeal way to keep development off of a particular parcel of land. And if we want to guide development in a way that makes sense for our community's food system, we need to start thinking, we need to start putting other tools in that toolbox and start thinking a little bit more comprehensively about implementing how we want to grow. So one of those, and I'm not, there's a whole bunch, if you want to talk about all the land use tools, there's way too many, and I'm not going to bore you guys to tears on that, and most people probably know more than I do about it. But so I've kind of taken my assignment from Josh and channeled it in, I think, mainly two ways that Missoula County might be poised to actually add some more tools to our land use planning. One is the mitigation ordinance, which is simply a lot of counties, communities, states and counties and cities have basically set up this thing that we're going to protect farmland at the same rate that we develop. Some people falsely call it a no net loss of farmland, and obviously if you're developing an acre of farmland and protecting one, you're still losing an acre. But the idea is that at least the developer pays for every acre of farmland that the developer builds on, is the developer's responsible for protecting another acre of farmland. And where that's failed is as an end in itself, as just, okay, it's kind of like an impact fee, just part of the game, and it doesn't really have much to do with the comprehensive plan and guiding how we want growth to happen. And part of, one of the themes I'll try to touch on is I really don't see population growth as a threat to agriculture unless we let it be. In a lot of ways, it's an economic opportunity if we grow in a way that protects the agricultural land base. More mouths to feed, more demand for local food, economic opportunity. Vermont, though, has done the mitigation ordinance in a way that I think we can learn from, where they really make the developer exhaust all other options before building on the best soil. The soil itself, stay off the prime land, prove to us that you really have no other alternatives. And then second, how is your development going to affect the adjacent farms? In Vermont's case, there's no ranches, but how's it going to affect those farms? In terms of that big picture. So, and then lastly, if there's really nothing you can do about it but just build on the best soil, then you can get hit pretty hard in terms of having the burden of protecting other land. And then there's also things you can do with efficiency, a sliding scale of using land efficiency efficiently in terms of encouraging high density, and the impact, the developer's chunk of change that protects other lands would be more if the land's used less efficiently, and I think you probably get the picture. I can move on from that. But I think that the Missoula County is in a place where we might consider doing that. We here might consider looking into this and pushing this, because we recently, until last year, a year ago, we included agricultural land in the definitions for our subdivision review definitions. Before that, agriculture was just defined as an activity, which is very vague and difficult to measure when you're looking at a subdivision proposal. How does this actually impact agriculture? Well, if it's just an activity, it's a little bit gray, but if it's you're on the best soil, that's a direct, obvious, measurable impact to agriculture, then it sets us up to possibly bring in something like a mitigation ordinance to give it a little more teeth than just have a long, drawn-out conversation that still ends up losing our farmland. And then zoning is another thing, obviously, that a lot of communities do to implement a plan, look at a whole landscape in terms of how the community wants to grow, how to implement the comprehensive growth plan. And most people here probably know a lot more about zoning than I do, so the only thing I want to say about it is in Missoula County and Montana, it's often a four-letter word. Consider a four-letter word. We don't like to talk about it in public, especially outside of the city limits. But I think a lot of people don't know that in 2005, there's a phone survey done of 880 people plus in the county about what they think about growth in the county. And zoning was one of the topics brought up. The majority of people in the county support county-wide zoning. There's 65% in the city proper and 54% in the county outside of the city. So that, I don't know, maybe that's another place we want to start thinking about. It might not be quite the four-letter word we think it is. And then lastly, no community has got this right. Urban sprawl sucks, and it's consuming our farmland, and in some places they've done a better job planning than others. But in general, it's a difficult battle. And in that, I think it's really important that we look at it beyond just how we focus development and the land that we protect, because farms and ranches are more than open space. Agriculture is an economic activity, and we need to bring that in, couple that with our development plans, our land use planning, if we really care about having farms and ranches on this landscape. So in doing that, I think that this emerging community food system that gets stronger and stronger is a great way to bolster the viability of these farms and ranches if we can help them tap into the local markets and take better advantage of it. One way is the farmers markets, and I don't think they're tapped out. And I'm not trying to downplay them at all here. I think they're fantastic, but they're for the smaller farms and some ranches. If we really want to, look at some of the medium size, especially farms and ranches, we need to start thinking more about our infrastructure. That Chrissy was talking about. Why is it so hard to eat the cattle on our hillsides? This lack of infrastructure is a serious problem. And so I think the one policy type program that I've seen that really brings economic development and land use planning together in the same program is a great example of this. Whether or not we do something like this or just learn from the example is Massachusetts has a state program called the Farm Viability Enhancement Program. And what they do is first, it's all farmer driven. First, the farmer writes out a business plan and an economic development strategy. And most of the time that's for direct marketing or doing some value-added production on the farm. And then, and they work with a state technical assistance to do a business plan. And this might sound really boring, but it's actually like, I get pretty psyched because one of the biggest threats to the viability of agriculture is a lack of business strategy and know-how for our producers. We, as a country, federal policy, we've told our producers, you produce a ton of food and we will take care of you. Meanwhile, they've seen food prices just not do much. Their profit margins dive. So they need to be business savvy about how they do this. So that's kind of the first big benefit of this Farm Viability Enhancement Program is the farmers get the business training and they come up with some economic development strategy they want to implement for their farm. Next, Massachusetts, if they're like, okay, this looks like a good plan, they give them a grant. It's not a loan. They give them a grant, $25,000, if they agree to put their farm in a covenant for 5 years. So you can't. They take the development pressure right off the farm for 5 years. The idea that their business plan will take 5 years to get going, and then as an economically viable farm, that can thwart the development pressure in itself, right? That's the ideal, is that we value our the farms and ranches themselves have enough value that development wouldn't go there anyways. It just wouldn't be a logical thing to do, to build on your best soil. And then, if you put it under a 10-year covenant, you can get $50,000 as a grant. And it's been an incredibly successful program. Like, out of 250 farms, only one farm is now no longer in business. And so I think there's, that's just one state program, and other states have tried to replicate it. I think there's a lot of opportunity here to do that, especially just having gone through the Grow Through Agriculture grant process, or just having written the grant. Hopefully we'll get some money. It's not a business plan, and it's really quite different from what this is doing. And I think the take-home message is, one, it's getting farmer entrepreneurs going in their business skills, but also in doing the things that, some of the barriers that we've mentioned, the value added, and then learning how to do more direct marketing. And then they also speak the banker's language when they need other loans. So I kind of think that's a great example of how we can bring economic development and land use planning together in achieving the larger vision of a working landscape intact. Because it's not just open space. And then, do I still have time?
A minute or two.
So then the last topic was how we might transfer our farms and ranches onto the next generation. And given the high development pressure and the difficult economic reality of farming and ranching, it makes it that much harder to pass your farm or ranch on to your kids or to the next generation. A lot of farm kids are choosing not to go into the business because they've seen their parents struggle. Beyond economics, it's a lot of hard work, and then added the economics, and then there's a lot of debt. We're looking at really high ages for your average age of farmer and rancher in western Montana is between 55 and 58 in all the counties in western Montana. That's a really high average age. So a lot of people are coming up to retirement, and a lot of them are in debt. So how do they get out of agriculture? How do they retire while also enabling the next generation to take advantage of some opportunities that hopefully our local food systems will continue to generate and just grow stronger and stronger? So there's some really cool examples you guys should ask me about.
Thanks, Paul.
All right. Well, I'm going to go at this from a slightly different angle, not because I in any way disagree with what the previous two speakers have said, but because I agree with it so strongly. So the question I want to raise is how do we muster the political will to do the kinds of policy changes that have been suggested, either at the state or the local or even at the national level? Well, I don't pretend that I've got the answer to how you do that, but what I want to suggest is that part of the way that we can do that, in fact, I would say part of the way we already have done that, is by recognizing that the changes that we want to see with regard to food and agriculture are just part of a larger social fabric, and that social fabric has to be strengthened in all parts simultaneously. And if it is strengthened in all parts simultaneously, then I think you're much more likely to have the political backing that you need to adopt any of these policies. So what am I talking about? That's all an abstraction. Let me get very concrete for a minute. In the heart of downtown Missoula, we now have this fantastic place called Brennan's Wave. Well, most of you know the story of Brennan's Wave, the kayak wave in downtown Missoula. Most of you have stood on the banks and watched the kayakers. A few of you may have been in the river. How did Brennan's Wave come about? Well, I'm not going to tell the whole complicated story, but the main parts of it are that for decades, an irrigation company had a bunch of concrete and rebar in the Clark Fork River, diverting the river over into their irrigation ditch, right over in front of the old Milwaukee Depot. Well, if you know anything about water law in Montana or the West, you know that an irrigation company has a right to their weir that is absolutely unassailable. So there was nothing that could ever be done to get that concrete and rebar out of the river. Well, that wouldn't be so bad, except it was an attractive nuisance. It did create a little bit of whitewater, and so kayakers and others would love to go and play in it, but it was very dangerous and it wasn't particularly good whitewater. So when Brennan Guth died in a kayaking accident in South America, some of his friends and family decided the time had come to build a kayak wave in Missoula. Well, what it took, of course, was this collaboration between the kayakers and the irrigators, because you had to keep the weir in the river. You still had to divert the water. But how could you do it so that the kayakers could have a place to play? Well, it took a tremendous amount of commitment, a tremendous amount of ingenuity, a tremendous amount of perseverance, particularly on the part of the kayakers to get that done. But they did get it done, and they got it done in a way, obviously, that met the needs of the farmers who use the water as well. And so that particular support for agriculture in the Missoula Valley was maintained, while the quality of life in Missoula was being tremendously enhanced. It's only a small story in a way, but it's part of a much bigger story that I think is very important. If we're going to take the pressure off of farmland that urban sprawl represents, then we're going to have to figure out how to persuade people that it's better to live compactly than spread out. It's just that simple. We have to, and you can't preach people into that point of view. All you can do is create ways of living that are appealing and that are sustainable. So I think if we look at Missoula, that we see that over the decades that sort of thing has happened in any number of ways. It's happened with farmers market. It's happened with the trails and parks along the river. It's happened with things like affordable housing, the work that Betsy Hands and her organization have done. All of these things fit together, and they all have to fit together. There's a lesson that I would draw from all this, and it goes roughly like this: the better things get, the better things get. So if you want to support sustainable agriculture, then do everything you can to support that. Support Chrissy's organization, support what Josh does, but also don't forget that if you want to support sustainable agriculture, support the trails and parks systems, support affordable housing, support whatever it is that makes life better in our community. And then one final thought along these lines. I wanted to quibble a little bit with the question that was given us in a couple of ways. One, is there a future for agriculture in Missoula County? Well, I would say, first of all, know where you are and know that except in policy terms, Missoula County isn't really a place. I mean, it's so oddly shaped that it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about Missoula County. So my question would be more, is there a future for agriculture in the Missoula food shed? And try to figure out what that food shed looks like and then support agriculture there. So it's a question of knowing where you are, and then there's a question of knowing when you are. So I would want to ask not only is there a future for all that we hold dear, but also is there a present? Because I've given this speech one other time, this part of the speech. I think we can distract ourselves by always worrying about what's to come and not paying attention to what's happening right now. My favorite story along those lines is from Alice in Wonderland, when Alice shows up at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, and she's just about to help herself to some bread and jam. She takes the bread, she starts to put the jam on it, and the Mad Hatter says, wait. You can't have jam. She said, why not? There's jam right here. He says, well, yes, there's jam right here, but we can never have jam today. We can only have jam tomorrow. Well, I think sometimes that's how we approach things, that we're so worried about the future that we fail to pay attention what's happening right here and now. So my closing advice would be, know where you are and know when you are, and be here now.
Thanks. Time for our guest.
Yeah, I'm a little bit of an imposter here, not being from
Not the real
Missoula or
guy.
living in Missoula, and being an academic who studies agriculture from a humanities perspective. But I think that this has been fascinating, listening to these issues, and my head's spinning as I hear all of you talk about the challenges and the policy planning, social, cultural demands of putting agriculture on more solid footing, local agriculture especially on solid footing in Missoula County. And I guess the way I want to I'll just have a few brief remarks because I actually want to hear more from everyone. And I don't want to steal too much of my own thunder, I guess, such thunder as it will be tomorrow. But I can tell you that I think this proposed solution to adopt this larger landscape level approach that is also more broadly social than just focusing on a narrow food production issue or consumption or sustainable agriculture in a compartment, I think is exactly right. And one of the things that attracted me to the agricultural question in environmental ethics to begin with was its connection to the other issues that are more classically considered environmental issues, wilderness, wildlife, and so on. I think we have a tendency to kind of balkanize our environmental concern, and we assume the Sierra Club does this, and the Wilderness Society does that, Friends of the Earth does this, and so on. And I think that's been a problem for American environmentalism, and I think that there are indications that balkanization is slowly starting to realign in a way that's maybe more productive. I think the death of environmentalism discussion has had something to do with this. But for my money, one way we can get around this problem is to look to history. I'm very interested in the kind of historical foundations of our thinking about environmental ethics and about environmental problems. And really that's what got me interested in the agricultural question through the work of Liberty Hyde Bailey, who I'll talk about tomorrow. You probably know
Cornell.
Bailey if you're Cornell. Half the buildings are named Bailey at Cornell. He was the first dean of agriculture at Cornell University, and he's really a forgotten figure in environmental ethics and in conservation history more generally. And I didn't know anything about Bailey. I vaguely knew the name. I grew up outside of Ithaca, so I knew the Bailey name. But in environmental ethics, his name is just not on the lips of writers in the field. And I learned of Bailey when I was working on this last book, and I was doing the canon. I was looking at Aldo Leopold, of course. And then I got interested in Benton Mackay and the Appalachian Trail. So it's pretty conventional wilderness stuff. And pretty soon Mackay got me interested in Lewis Mumford, who was an urbanist and a regional planning theorist. And was another forgotten figure in American environmentalism because he wrote about cities, right, and technology. My interest in Mumford then led me to Bailey because Mumford, for some strange reason, writing for the New Yorker in the 1920s in New York City, wanted to write about Liberty Hyde Bailey, who was writing about agriculture in the country. And I thought, what a remarkable time period where people like Mumford, Bailey, Mackay, even Leopold could traffic in all those different ideas, those different landscapes, those different, what we think of today as maybe conservation targets. And they formed associations and communities where they interacted. Right? It was a very vibrant time in sort of progressive conservation circles. And I started to wonder why Bailey wasn't better known in environmental ethics. And that led me smack to the problem of environmental ethics when it comes to working landscapes, agriculture, or forestry, or whatnot. And that is that the worked or altered land is denigrated by environmental ethics because it's the fallen land. It's the land that's polluted by human will and human intent, and it has less value. And that is still kind of the dominant attitude in a lot of environmental ethics thinking. So you can see how agriculture, agrarian issues would not be a centerpiece of the field's discussion. That led me then to think, well, maybe Bailey has something to say, not just about environmental ethics, but maybe he has something to say to us today as we're struggling with these issues of the relocalization of agriculture, of the globalization of food, the rise of the large mega farm, the decay in the number of small farms, and so on, the concern over sustainability and chemical fertilizers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look at Bailey's work, you do find that he anticipated a lot of the problems we're still struggling with 100 years later. I mean, this was a guy who was worried about the erosion of country life. He was worried about people leaving the farm for the city, right, and for other pursuits. And he thought that the only way you could guarantee that people would want to be on the farm is that you'd make farm life interesting, right, vibrant, beautiful, productive, yes, but inspiring. And so that's why he was very interested in education and nature study and that sort of thing. But Bailey was an agrarian. At the same time, he wrote as a biocentrist. I mean, he would write that the earth was holy. That, there was great value in the earth that was almost independent of any human, appreciating it in a sense. And so Bailey was what you call kind of a biocentric farmer, which today to us sounds maybe a little bizarre, but I think that's partly because of how the environmental story has developed since. There's been a kind of pure channeling of ideology in American environmentalism that has been very much about wilderness and wildlife, and it's changing slowly. But I think that's the dominant storyline. And Bailey, I think, was there at the beginning anticipating a lot of the problems that we continue to grapple with. He had a hand in it. He was a great booster of science and technology. He was a progressive after all. But he was also very concerned that we would develop a science and technology that would be adaptive, not controlling, and that dominion would be exercised in a very solicitous way toward the natural world. So I see him as an inspirational figure, not just for changing the way we talk about agriculture, work, human value in the discussion of environmental ethics, but for the new movements we see today in civic agriculture, as Tom Lyson, who recently passed away, a Cornell University sociologist, has branded this kind of amalgam of community-supported agriculture that's going on here. Farmers markets, restaurant agriculture, U-pick operations, rooftop gardens, right? That these are all indications of a new institutional form where are kind of flying under the radar screen, I think, of the USDA often. But they're vibrant. I mean, everyone here is saying that these are real. They are here to stay. What we need to do is make them more powerful. I think Bailey gives us kind of, and there are others, heirs, Wendell Berry and others, of course. But Bailey gives us kind of a foundation, a historical warrant, or a justification, a pathway through the tradition to understand how these questions can be asked, how they might be answered, and how that bond between the farmer and nature, in Bailey's view, was the bond that connected all of us to the planet. And that's why he thought that farmers were, in a sense, the salvation of civilization. Once we lose that purchase on the land, and that would be a horrible thing. And I think we can see that echoing through later environment. Aldo Leopold would say the same thing, was very influenced by Bailey's work. And so I think that the turn to history for a usable past, for rethinking some of these ethical orientations toward nature, a more positive view of productive work on the land, a more appreciative view of agricultural stewardship, an understanding of the civic potential of local agriculture. All of these threads, I think, run deep in the American tradition, and I think it's important to remember that. I think there's a sense in which we feel that this is an alternative to industrial agriculture of today, and of course it is, but it's also something that goes very deep in our political and environmental culture, and I think we would do well to revisit that as we explore some of these questions.
Thanks. So let's hear from you. What do you think?
I think we should thank our speakers. That was fantastic.
Please, Betsy.
I'll ask the ugly question. As a public policy maker and a developer, does anybody on the panel want to address the role of private property rights in this discussion and kind of how that fits into our cultural understanding of
I think the dog's stepping up actually for that.
Roxy said, I can tell us one little thing out from. I don't have any public policy experience. I've just lived here a long time. I feel like any hope for a solution to how we can keep agricultural land open in the face of tremendous development pressure and really high land values, any hope rests on allowing landowners to receive the return on investment they would get from building on it. I don't think we have any hope, and it may not even be ethically correct to expect these folks to sacrifice for the greater good. And the ethical questions aside, I don't think it's practical. As Paul mentioned, the conservation easement, this is a tool for land preservation that's really attractive only to a very small group of people who fit in the right tax bracket. I think if we were to say, well, you with your 100 acres out there off Mullen Road, I'm sorry, it's too good of soil, you can't develop it. Unless we were to reimburse those people for the same amount, to the tune that they would have received for developing it, we have no hope of passing that type of legislation. So there's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I don't think that that there is any future that I can foresee that that would involve any kind of direct undermining or attack on private property rights. I think the good news is that that many of the people who have sort of rested a very regressive case on private property rights, I think are beginning to re-examine what I would call their enlightened self-interest. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. Throughout the years when I was in the Montana legislature, you could count on the realtors in Montana being an absolutely unified force in opposition to anything having to do with subdivision regulation or land use regulation of any kind. As an organization, they're still, as you know, a major force in that field, but they're a much more fragmented force than they once were. Why? Because more and more realtors are coming to recognize that the value of land, which is their bread and butter, is enhanced more by quality of life and quality of community than by anything else. And so you see more and more, at least local realtors organizations, beginning to become really fairly progressive in terms of some of the ways that they support community building. Another example, as you know, we had this whole series of citizen initiatives, especially across the West in the last election, that sought to enact regulatory takings legislation. that basically would have gutted the potential of local governments in particular to do any kind of a progressive land use control. There was support for that, but there was also a surprising breadth of opposition, so that in Idaho, for example, that initiative failed because of a coalition that included a large number of chambers of commerce across the state of Idaho. Why did they oppose it? I think for exactly the same reason, that they look at their enlightened self-interest, the enlightened self-interest of businesses. They see that workable communities are absolutely fundamental to their businesses doing well. And they understand that communities can't work well if in the name of private property rights we take away all of the tools that local governments need.
I would add just one small point to that. I mean, I think we also see this movement toward strange bedfellows of ranchers and land trusts and environmental groups working together to fight sprawl, right? To fight development that threatens both of their interests. So I think that's another kind of countervailing trend that doesn't require any great ethical transformation on the part of landowners, but rather requires perhaps a little bit of political savvy and coalition building.
I have a little trouble with how you're defining ethics. And then the second thing I would like to comment, I mean, I don't know how you want to explain that to me, but, or if you would. But the other part is, you mentioned Bailey, but I didn't hear any reference to, like, Wendell Berry, who, you know, to me is, you know, speaks maybe on the heart and the feeling relationship, maybe more spiritual toward land, and is the basis of ethics. And I was wondering if someone could address that, or you're familiar with Wendell Berry, I'm certain, or someone else that would address that. Or is Wendell Berry not grounded enough for this discussion? And
No, that's a good question. I did mention him in passing. Berry's part of the kind of neo-agrarian movement today. People like Wes Jackson, Wendell Berry,
Yeah.
Gene Lodgson, others. Berry, I think, was heavily influenced by Bailey's work. I think that's very clear. And I think he's in that tradition, although I think Berry's more of a conservative than Bailey certainly was. On the definition of, and so his work is, you know, I mean, it's very important to this kind of reclamation of a culture of agriculture in the modern era. You know, Berry is just a scathing critic of a lot of modern technology, and you know, the industrialization of agriculture. The Unsettling of America is probably his classic book, right? But in terms of the definition of ethics, well, that's a huge, multiple cans of worms. It's clear that when I'm talking about Liberty Hyde Bailey and his understanding of ethical regard for the land, his was very much an ethics that derived both from the science of evolution — he was a plant scientist — and his belief in a divine creation. And so there was a kind of a biblical reference to that foundation for Bailey. You know, most academic philosophers, right, would found ethics in reason, and it's not, you know, founded on any kind of divine command or something like that. You know, so if we're talking about right and wrong, or duty and obligation, harm and benefit, we can explain all of those through a purely kind of secular discussion that has to do with, you know, the human rationality, or you know, the kind of the logic of language or something like that. And there are all sorts of moral traditions there in the Western tradition. So it's a wide open field. There, those who write about agriculture today come from all corners: politically conservative, you know, radically, you know, progressive, creationist, materialist, communitarian, liberal, etc. And so I think that that's good. They're all talking about why agriculture matters. And I don't think we necessarily have to follow everyone's foundational argument to agree that we're all talking about something vitally important, and we need not perhaps drive wedges between us if we're arguing from different premises.
Sarah.
Question, probably mostly for Chrissy, but to anyone else who wants to speak to it as well, the idea of supply and demand and what it would take to put in some of the infrastructure to get some of those products in the school system. I'm thinking, in the high school system, they talk about, well, there are not enough cheesemakers in this county to possibly supply the schools with the cheese that we would need. So what would it look like, and how close are we to getting there to have some of those products actually come in and into the school system?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's why I really like working with public institutions, because they're a great example. They can point it out really quickly of what kinds of things need to happen. And yeah, so Missoula County Public Schools can already say, well, we're running out of producers. We're running out of food to buy, and they're still only buying a tiny fraction of their food from local suppliers. And as far as what it would take, that's what is in terms of numbers, like how many new cheese processors do we need, or how many new types of food processing facilities we'll need. That's the kind of thing we're hoping to get at in this study that we're doing over the next 2 years, that this Economic Affairs Interim Committee is taken on through the legislature. I don't know that they'll come up with a specific plan like we need X million dollars invested here and there, but hopefully they will give us a better sense of what those more specific opportunities are, because it's really tricky, because we think we can create more demand than we have supply easily, especially at the institutions. And so how do we keep that balance going, because you still need that demand to show that there's to show that we should invest in the supply, right? So so that's what we're hoping to figure out in terms of more specifics. And does anyone else have?
I would add to that. I mean, I think the public institutions is a great place for the state, to say it's a priority to us to help to support our farms and ranches, and in 2 examples, it's done a lot for building that infrastructure for value added, especially distribution's another piece of infrastructure we need to look at. But the value added, there's a place in Whitehall, Montana called Bausch Potato. And he's really expanded his business quite a bit through working with public institutions. He grows most of the potatoes, and then he cuts them up into French fries and hash browns and diced and all that. So it's a pretty simple value-added operation, but universities, most restaurants are not going to buy a whole potato and then cut it up and do all that. They're just not going to do it. So unless we have those businesses in the state that are providing that service, then forget it. They're just not gonna. It's not gonna come from nearby. So for the university to make that a priority, we want to buy local food, and it's not just we're gonna buy it when it's there, but we're willing to work with growers. There's been a lot of feedback that's gone on between the University of Montana and Mark Bausch in what works about his product and what doesn't, and so he's been able to do a lot of. He doesn't just lose the business, but because it's a state institution, we've said we want to support you. And then in another case where there wasn't much value added going on, the Western Montana Growers Cooperative, where the University of Montana is supporting that cooperative quite a bit by giving them a good chunk of business. But then it's working with them to say, hey, we'd really like this type of value added product. How can we work with you and give you a promised market? So we will buy it if you do this. This is just that communication that you don't get most of the time. If you're just looking at if you're a restaurant owner and you're looking at a Cisco catalog, you don't have that communication with the agricultural business. You're dealing straight with a Cisco person who's then dealing with someone who smokes bacon and someone who makes French fries, and they're probably really far away. So that's another way I think that it supports entrepreneurs on farms and ranches and developing that infrastructure in a way that makes sense for a community-based food system, not a enormous, confined animal feed operation. Because that's the last thing we need when we talk about value added. It's just something that we don't need to supply Japan with poultry that pollutes our groundwater in Missoula County.
Hey, Stuart.
One of the things I think that's interesting about the local food movement recently is the impact of food security and the sort of general terrorism that we're all supposed to be living in fear of all the time. And certainly when the E. coli, you and I were talking when that E. coli scare came out with the spinach, and we talked about, gosh, we've got spinach producers right here who could, produce all this, except yet, now we're shipping all these things in from California. We actually, instead of having a system that can isolate any threat, whether it's unintentional or truly terrorism, we have a system that actually is designed to sort of infect the rest of the system. Crazy idea, and tell me how crazy it is, I guess is my point. At what point does this rise to the level where we treat food safety and local food production as a true right that the government should be providing to us in terms of our own security? And I'm honestly thinking about something along the lines of, like Public Service Commission. We have a electrical grid that is managed by the powers that be because it's deemed so important to everybody that it has to be managed that way. At what point does, we've got municipal water, we've got municipal waste treatment. At what point does food supply
seem to be really active in our response to crises, but we don't maybe care so much about the future. And that if we see a handful more of these things, there will be a point, it'll add up, and then all of a sudden someone will have to take action, or you as a politician will be considered weak on food unless you take action now. And we as a culture don't seem to be tremendously long on foresight, but we're great at jumping in with both feet and filling sandbags and rushing to New Orleans after the problem has taken place. And I don't know how many more do we need before the paradigm shifts. 2, 3, 4, 5, how many more people need to die? And that sounds overly dramatic, but I don't mean it to be that way. A certain number of crises will have to happen, and then we'll say, oh, we got to do something. My guess is the response will be to strengthen the sanitation controls on mega farms and on mega food processors, as opposed to saying, well, really what we need to do is decentralize this. If we want to negate the potential for terrorists to threaten our food system, we need to have lots and lots of little food systems. So maybe they'll do in Missoula, but Billings will be okay, instead of putting poison in that one giant sink in Salinas that washes all the lettuce for everyone.
I think that, this is probably another place where it gets to that fragmentation issue of environmental issues I was talking about. Because on the one hand, food security would seem to be an issue that could be what you'd say is ethically overdetermined. There are so many reasons why we should care about it, right? I mean, we should care about it if we care about the soil, if we care about community vitality, if we care about future generations, if we care about animals, you can make a long list of reasons why we ought to care. The problem is that they're sort of cordoned off from one another often. And together they're quite powerful, and they can appeal to broad constituencies of people who are just concerned about being able to eat safe food and have it available, people concerned about their children, their grandchildren, future generations, the environment. The problem is we aren't very good at weaving those discourses together and tying them then to political action. We like to separate them, and as a result, that balkanization, I think, creates a kind of immobility, and then maybe we have crises. But it seems to me that they're kind of sleeper cells, to keep with the terrorism thing. They're ethical sleeper cells kind of waiting to be activated. But the question is, what will activate them? Can it be something other than a crisis? It would be nice to think so.
I was going to add that one of the things I meant to mention that I haven't, that I think we need to work on, is actually our current food safety laws that are completely geared towards these large-scale industrial farms, and they often become a stumbling block for local agriculture. And Grow Montana attempted to work on a couple of different food safety issues that local farmers were running into. For example, right now it's illegal to slaughter your chickens on your farm and even sell them just directly to your friend, even if you know exactly who you're going to sell it to and that person knows that you slaughtered it on farm. Technically, that's illegal. And, I think there are valid food safety concerns around slaughtering animals and selling them for consumption. At the same time, I think that there are in other states have some pretty simple safety guidelines that you can follow and then get permitted, and it's pretty easy to do. Well, in Montana, that's just not the case, and when we went to talk to the Department of Livestock and the Department of Health and Human Services food safety person, first of all, both of them govern it, and they both have their own sets of rules about what you can slaughter and how you can sell it. And then, second of all, they had never really talked to each other before. And third of all, they really didn't want to talk to us. So it was just really complicated. And when we tried to start talking about, well, aren't you concerned about, what about the food safety concerns with 10,000 chickens in one place, as you were talking about? And, they were just like, what are you talking about? That's not a safety concern because that is governed by the USDA. And so it's just this whole new set of things that I think we're going to have to address more and more as we keep developing new local food businesses as well.
There's a sign on Highway 12 that always makes my head spin. Most of you have probably seen it. If you're driving down from Lolo Pass towards 93 in Lolo there, you go past those new developments on your left, Longhorn Flat, and there's another one a little further down. And then just before you get into Lolo, there's a big old sort of farmhouse type building that has a sign saying "Victim of Density."
Victim of density.
And I guess it's hard to work out what it's for, but I guess the worry is that there's now 40 odd homes, just one field away from where this guy lives. So I was thinking about that, in relation to where we sit right now. Here's a really nice thing about having agriculture in town. We can come up and listen to talks like this in a location like this. But we're sitting in a place where there are proposed subdivisions up on our left there, up on the left of Duncan Drive. And, there's a question about density there. Would Josh become a victim of density if there were 60 houses up there? Less so, or more so than if there were 12 or 15 houses up there.
Paul, you said something I think that rings true, and Stuart may have something valuable to add to this too, but working with development as a means to agricultural preservation. I don't think density is necessarily a bad thing. Maybe a solution that's been used in other places is to allow a clustering of houses. Take the same density that would have been spread across 10 acres or 20 acres and put them on a couple, and then you can preserve some open land and actually use development to pay for agriculture. Instead of development doing in agriculture, development could actually pay for agriculture. But we all have to get on the same page, as Dan was sort of saying, to make something like this happen. Out where I live in Target Range, density is a 4-letter word. Dyslexia aside, the people up there, there are big signs saying preserve our rural character, 1 per acre. Thinking 1 per acre, that's not rural, that's the suburbs. And people are thinking that density means every square inch has a house, as opposed to density meaning you just put some houses closer together. You don't necessarily have to smear the landscape with them. I think we need to think about density differently, and I really like what you said, Dan, about putting us sharing an ideal of quality of life, and that these things will follow. Stuart's done some great work, and I think in the future we'll see it. The houses built this way will actually be worth more than the houses across the street where there's 1 per acre, where it's the saying is they're too big to mow and too small to plow. We're headed that way.
At the same time that there are subdivisions planned for up there, there's also citizen-initiated zoning that's been in the works. And the density is 2 per acre, which is hardly dense, and it's more suburban in character. And one of the arguments that's come up and it took quite a bit of consensus building in order to get this. Someone said, if we're serious about preserving agricultural land, we should have more houses than that up on those hillsides because they're no good for anything but houses, essentially. I mean, there's also obviously wildlife concerns. I'm curious about your take on that kind of thing, values with policy.
I don't know. I think with this place and every place, the specifics of the place should be telling us what we should and shouldn't do. And there's the homestead right over there, and 400 and some odd acres in an easement, and this is only one little road. How many houses could we put up here that could just be served by one little road? Are there emergency service questions? Where would schools go? How much of an impact would this have on the wildlife that use the homestead or the corridor here? And if we make every place sacred, where are people going to live? What's this going to do to housing costs? These are really hard puzzles to solve, but I think they need to be looked at really specifically as this hillside or that piece of flat land out in Target Range, and be really sensitive to the character of the area right around it, rather than trying to paint with such a broad brush.
Is the future of agriculture at stake in a discussion like this?
Yeah, I think so. I think the biggest thing that will make agriculture impossible in the future is this high value of land. Flat land costs so much money. How can you farm on it? The land out near my house, $100,000 an acre, and that's without the sewer. So there you only get 1 per acre. It can never be, it can't be farmed. It can't be farmed unless there's 1 or 2 wealthy landowners that have a real sense of vision and are willing to take that financial sacrifice. Unless we, with fomenting some political will to create change, if we don't do anything, there will be a time in the fairly near future when farming won't be possible because it will all be built out. At $100,000 an acre, why would anyone not? There, Albert.
From conservatives, you get the reply that if you look at the country as a whole, there's enough agricultural land, more than enough. And although, this 1 house per acre is aesthetically and socially disastrous, it's not agriculturally disastrous. People have pointed out that all the built space in the contiguous United States would fit into Texas. There's just this relatively small chunk of the whole thing. So, so I'm not sure, where the hard facts of there's not enough agricultural land consists with the aesthetic and the social questions. Where I think the smearing out the landscape is a social and aesthetic disaster.
I'll try and keep more quiet. I'll do a little bit, and then you guys should take this on. But the scenario you've described, well, there's enough land far away, we don't have to worry about it here. Underneath that is the assumption that as long as food gets here, it doesn't matter where it was grown. And maybe we can even take another step and say, well, as long as it gets here, it doesn't matter how it was grown. All that really matters is that it arrives. And I would say that there's this whole list of goods that you were rattling off there that could be explained at greater length on why having a vibrant local agriculture is important. The real easy one in the short term is to say that right now energy-wise, we're dependent obviously on a very finite resource. One that we've seen go up in price as its finitude becomes more obvious. I can only imagine more of the same in the future. What type of situation would we be in when diesel is $7 or $8 a gallon and we're depending on Texas for our lettuce or California for our lettuce? Or we can go down the road, this terrorist situation, right, where everything's produced in one place. I think shipping our food all over the place opens us up to all types of vulnerabilities, ecological vulnerabilities, economic vulnerabilities, and food safety vulnerabilities, as well as it being bad for our local culture and the social things that you described. I guess my one sentence on this is that last sentence. That assumption, that the underlying assumption in the scenario you're describing says all food is equal, no matter where it comes from, and I would say that's not the case. You better make it better.
No, I did it well. No, I mean, I understand his point. I mean, it's partly a strategic question. I mean, do you want to put all your eggs in the economic basket and basically make that the argument that you lead with for preserving a certain local agriculture? And I think the point is that that argument can fail if indeed we can get good agriculture. Of course, it means, what do we mean by good, right? I mean, so what you're saying is that the price is too high, literally, but also I think you're agreeing that socially, culturally, and so on, there are also high prices to be paid. So, yeah, I think it's partly a strategic issue. I think, this reminds me of a lot of arguments in environmentalism about, we're all going to run out of this, we're going to run out of that, and so on. And sometimes it actually doesn't happen, and we don't run out of things. And then environmentalists are left scurrying to figure out, well, we better make a different argument now, right? That, okay, it's not a prudential argument anymore. We're going to make a moral argument that, darn it, we just want this because it's part of a good life, whether or not it's economically scarce or not, physically scarce or not. It's part of what a good culture has around it. So it is partly a strategic issue and an issue of consistency, and I don't think that's a small question. I think that probably is a big part of it. I think that sometimes can get lost in the economic discussion. The way of life, the quality of life, the meaning, the culture of local agriculture is I think a big part of what everyone wants to sustain.
Bravo.
Has anyone talked about the policy yet? I stepped away for a few minutes. Like, as far as like policy enacting, you said the ugly. Like, to make it happen, policy has to be enacted. I just don't want to ask the same question.
Yeah, they kind of beat it a bit. You want to know about policies. You can corner Christy when she's done. Then she won't have to repeat herself.
Well, yeah, no. My question was, and maybe it's just when you talked about policy, it seems to me that the people that, the people that are elected make the policy. Well, in Missoula County, we're fairly liberal, more maybe green, and we actually, I don't know if we have any Green Party people in the city, but, once you get out into the more rural areas, we are a very conservative state, and so, and like you and I saw that in Bhutan, when it was going to a democracy. Well, the king said, okay, everyone has to be organic. But then he does this parliament, and a lot of the people that were going to parliament were educated in this theory that the Green Revolution was a good thing, and chemicals, and the more food you could grow per acre, and the more intense you could be, and so, and then you also get national policy trumps state policy, which perhaps trumps local policy. So even if we were to come up with a local policy that was, some of the things that we've talked about, does it get trumped? I mean, how do we, and everything being integrated together with a holistic approach, it just seems kind of complicated, with where we live, until there's a major, the Green Party, they're not going to be elected in 2008, and I'm not sure when, but those are the people that seems to me, if we were doing major things with policy, would need to get into office to really make some of these decisions that perhaps could be looked at by conservatives to affect private property rights, to affect, monetary value of land, and, what's the best way to deal with that?
So Grow Montana, as I mentioned before, is a coalition, and when we first started in 2005, we were a pretty left-leaning set of organizations. We had Alternative Energy Resources Organization. We're housed by the National Center for Appropriate Technology. Definitely some kind of greenies, all working together. But our strategy was to use really positive visioning language about a Montana-based food system that keeps farmers and ranchers on the land and that provides healthy, locally grown food to all of us, no matter what our income level. And when we started just using that kind of common language, and we let drop any kind of controversial topics, to be honest, so that we could start building our coalition, and we had great success in terms of really getting some non-traditional partners, for us at least. In all of our bills, I believe the Farm Bureau supported them, the Montana stock growers supported them, and the grain growers. And if you're not familiar with the kind of ag groups, those are the top 3 most conservative agriculture groups by far in the state, and they have a lot of political power. We also have the Montana Farmers Union, who, are maybe a little bit more liberal but they're still a fairly conservative farm group, a fairly traditional farm organization, I should say, and they're on our steering committee, and they're a strong leader for Grow Montana. So I think once we start carefully choosing our language and start carefully working together, and we all had these successes, and they all started saying, hey, you guys aren't so bad after all, and it started forming these new relationships that I think we can start tackling even some more controversial issues in the future now that we have this working relationship, and we know that we do have at least at some level, there is a common vision. We do all want to support Montana's food and agriculture system. So I think that at all different kinds of levels, we can start doing these similar coalition building things where let's start. There may be things that we're going to end up parting on, but let's start with the things that we all want.
But can I follow up? I mean,
Sure.
but all of those initiatives that you've done, I mean, they've all basically been economically viable, like bottom line modern economics. And I've been reading Gene Lodson, and he kind of spins that whole theory on his head, and it's neat. And talking about, well, we can't run our economy based on, okay, this is profitable, the economy of scale, 5,000 acres is better than 500 acres, so on and so forth.
Maybe just very quick.
Yeah.
Very quick.
Okay, so, to me, the answer is that when you do 5,000 acres may be more efficient in some ways, but it doesn't provide the most return to the most people. And that's the kind of thing that we've been talking about at Grow Montana, and we're calling it community-based economic development. So we've explicitly said we're not talking about, a huge barley malting plant that brings in an out-of-state company or multinational company, because they're only going to employ 5 people. We're talking about a smaller scale thing that may not produce as large a quantity of food or food products, but it's going to employ 50 people instead and keep a lot more money circulating in the community, I suppose.
Well, it's a beautiful evening. I hope you stay around and keep the conversation going. And thank you for coming. Thank you for...
And let's give one more plug for Ben's talk tomorrow night.
Yeah, and one more plug.
Yeah.
Ben's kind of, we didn't know this weather was going to be this nice, so we scheduled it inside, thinking air conditioning would be a plus. So Ben will be talking at 7:30 tomorrow night at the Gallagher Business Building, room 123, and I hope I'll see you there. And we have a whole bunch of other talks. I'm going to put the flyers out here on a rock, and you can just grab them as you go out. But thank you to our speakers. They were fantastic.
You're welcome to wander around and make yourself at home here.